It's been a lot. I'm not exactly sure what to say first, as I'm so behind on updates. But as I'd mentioned a couple weeks ago in the first video where I talked about what I'm doing here in Paraguay, there are a couple different groups of indigenous people here in Paraguay. And within the Guarani language, there are two in this area different, basically family groups or tribes. The Ava and the Mbu'a are here in this area. The Mbu'a, there's a small community near here in my neighborhood where I've decided to kind of focus most of my time for two reasons. One reason, I can walk there without inconveniencing anyone or paying any money. The other reason is, and along with the first reason, it means that there's a lot of different good I can do. Like I can bring milk down. I went and I was able to plant some trees there for future fruitification. I'll be able to do cleanup projects of the forest there. Essentially, they live in these houses with tarps over them. It's kind of tiny little, I won't say shacks, but like kind of makeshift wood things with tarps over top of them. For the most part, some people have pieced together like metal or other things on top. There's one lady who has found like a piece of plastic that she's turned into a window, but by and large, very, very small, like just a little bit bigger than my bed or this room, places just to sleep, right? So right now it's becoming winter and there's a lot of exposure to the cold. So one of the projects we've been doing has been looking at getting blankets for the indigenous people group. And talking to other Paraguayans, there definitely is somewhat of an anti-indigenous feeling among a lot of Paraguayans. There was one police officer I talked to this week who, like, as soon as I mentioned indigenous ministry, he was like, "Oh, they're all bad, all the." And he said, like, he essentially said the Indians are fucked, is what he said in his language. Just like, wow, cool. All right. So there's definitely some of that kind of thinking. Somebody else who's very well-meaning said, like, why blankets for them? They have special genetics that makes them not get cold. But when I talked to them, they asked me for blankets. So according to them, they don't have a special genetics that makes them get cold. According to them, they get cold. So there's people who are well-meaning, and then there are people who are like that guy, like that police officer said. But even that police officer, like, was willing to be a contact for me for things like investigation for sexual abuse and stuff like that. And as he mentioned, and as I've heard other people say who've worked with the communities, there's very little actual investigation of sexual abuse that goes on within the indigenous community, partly because of legal issues, like they have a lot of autonomy, but also secondly, just because of this feeling that there's nothing you can do, that there's no point. So that's kind of the global where we sit. But this community being so close to me, I have the opportunity to kind of get to know people. I found out who the leader was of this local group. I now understand some of the social tensions. For example, there's one young woman who has a couple of kids. She's a single mother who she recently became baptized and professed faith as a Christian. There is another lady in the community who doesn't get along well with the rest of the community and who is so what they believe is happening is that this person is casting spells on people she doesn't like. That is a thing that is believed. So this particular young woman who has just professed faith, which for some people is a not allowed thing to do. Like in the other community, Itarumandu, which is further away, where I've decided not to focus as much energy or not to go. That community is really beautifully built up. It's quite wealthy, but there's a lot of control. You're not allowed to profess any beliefs that are different than what the leadership believe. So in that belief, the shamans really have like so much power that they'll walk around the classrooms of the children to make sure nothing is being said that is opposed to the leadership's beliefs. So this lady here in this community, which is a little more free, who has been baptized, for her, there are definitely people within the culture that would consider her kind of a traitor. And it seems to be that that's kind of the tension between her and this other lady who, and so in order not to cause trouble, this young lady with her new faith is actually thinking about moving to another city so as to avoid causing annoyance to this person and receiving further spells. So, and I shouldn't do like this because I should be respectful of their beliefs and their culture, and within their culture, that is what is happening. We may have different perspectives on spells and magic and things like that, but for their culture, that is universally a given thing. So I shouldn't do like this. That's not really very polite. So, so with that tension, this lady, if she moves somewhere else, is going to lose a lot of the aid that she receives, because if she goes somewhere else, she's going to not be near this local area where they've been looking at trying to get her own land. They've been looking at trying to help her out with food and clothing and other stuff like that. But like, for example, when I asked her, like, oh, has somebody in the community been like bothering you, causing you trouble? And she says, no, I bother somebody, which is very interesting. And she wouldn't make eye contact after that and kind of looked away. And this is the young lady, young Christian Mbua. So I talked to other folks within her community, well, specifically the pastor's wife of the church at which she attends, and kind of got some of this backstory that essentially it seems like, from listening to them, that she feels like her existence is a bother or a threat. And she feels like as a result, this person is casting things on her. And so that makes her want to take her children somewhere away. So those are the kind of like dramas and tensions that they have. But this community that's nearby is still quite free, right? You can be someone who casts spells, or you can be someone who gets baptized, and you're still allowed to be part of the community. Versus that other community in Itarumandu is very controlled. So that other community is the community where I had mentioned they had the like known child sexual abuse that was then where the teacher was then punished, who had reported it and had to move somewhere else. So that community I was very interested in getting into and starting to work, but it became kind of clear that it was going to be incredibly difficult even to get permission to teach a PE class, because the idea was at the back end of the PE class I would be able to talk about, you know, because it was going to be like a martial arts PE class, like this is how, these are some ways you can defend yourself, and here's an important, you know, thing for defending yourself. And so I've actually started doing that class here at this community nearby, where I'll show a technique that children can learn that's actually useful against adults, things like using adult size against them and things like that. So small techniques children can learn to get out of adults' arms so they can run away and escape for at least a short enough time to scream and get help. So I've been teaching them those techniques, and then at the end of the techniques, I show like a UNICEF video for children, like a little cartoon on like, hey, if someone touches you, these places, this is what you need to go do. So for example, well, I mean, you get it. It's like the bad touching, what is bad touching, what is, you know, a bad secret. Basically inculcating in children the ability to have the right to say no, and the ability to go tell a trusted adult when somebody is touching them who shouldn't be. So essentially trying to give some agency to children, because one of the biggest problems in these kind of investigations is the child becomes too ashamed or too afraid to say what is happening to them. So those classes, we just had the second class this week, and the kids are loving it. I was a little bit nervous the first class because there were some adults there, and I was worried that they would be scandalized. When I was a kid, I was not taught these kind of things. I mean, we didn't talk about body parts in that language in my house growing up. So using the actual anatomic names for body parts and things like that so children know how to testify for themselves, even in like a small, like 1 minute child-friendly cartoon, is a little bit, for me, it made me nervous. Even though it's my job, it made me nervous because of the adults being there. I didn't want the parents to be scandalized. But actually, the 3 parents who were there, because it was mostly a bunch of kids that I rounded up from the neighborhood, and they came over and they all sit down on a log and we watched the little video. We practiced the techniques, and at the end I quizzed them on safety for their physical autonomy. And actually one of the parents helped me to translate my Guarani for the ending parts, because the beginning parts you just demonstrate and they get it, they see visually. And it's a lot of fun because you have the kids fighting with you and throw you on the ground and stuff like that. Some of the kids pick them up right away. There's a little girl who's just phenomenal. Like, she actually did knock me down last week. The rest of them, and she was small, the rest of them, you pretend and so forth for their benefit and teach them. And then there was one that, like, I couldn't even pretend. I had to be like, no, poking my knee is not going to knock me down. I will kidnap you if you poke my knee. Howdy, my night is well boosted. It's good to see you. So teaching the self-defense class for kids, with this focus on preventing these darker happenings, has been pretty rewarding so far. The kids seem to love it. And like I said, one of the girls really picked it up right away, because the technique, that particular technique, the child needs to go sideways at the adult's ankles so that the adult falls over. You have to know kind of how to angle your body, and she picked it up right away. She knew where to put her foot, she planted, and she knocked me right down. And that gives the child a chance to run away and scream and ask for help, right? Which is really cool. And then yesterday we did techniques where, like, if someone scoops you up from the side and you're a small child and they're going to carry you away, how they can use their elbow to hit the adult in the eye or the temple, because they're going to be carried sideways like this, and so then they elbow you. And using their other fist to whack the adult in between parts so that the adult lets them go. So essentially teaching children warfare against adults. Which I've been really enjoying and really excited about, because, on the kind of sadder note, there's a child who's living with the family where the lady is kind of against these other ladies, allegedly. The child, there was a period last week where I walked kind of in on something that put up all the red flag signs for me for abuse. And the little child was her behavior was unusual. The behavior of the mother was incredibly unusual. The behavior of the adult male, who seemed to be putting on his pants and readjusting things, and really putting things away. There were just a number of red flag signs for abuse. And I've been surprised along my own health journey. You all know that with some of the PTSD stuff, I've been quite worried and afraid about tackling any of these kind of situations again. And it's been going really well. Was able to really kind of logically process next steps, talk to community leaders, and kind of figure out what would be necessary in order to figure out things like reporting. And talked with counsel here in the United States that gave me some feedback as well. Another person who's an expert in these kind of cases. And it was a little hard to sleep after that first night, but like I'm okay. And that's been phenomenal to see that, like, yeah, I've gotten so much better. Whereas, like, I remember last year I gave a talk on sexual assault, and for a week after was intensely suicidal because all the memories and everything were coming back, and it was just so terrible and so dark and awful. And this time it was like, you know, we're a lot more okay. So it's still pretty heavy on my heart. So if you are a praying person, if you will, think of this little girl. She's a 5-year-old in the Mbu'a community. Her name begins with an L. We will leave it at that. And if you're a praying person, if you can think about her, so that, and pray that if there is something going on, it would become infinitely clear, so it would be really easy to report, right? That, like, I or someone else will walk in on it and see very clearly exactly what's happening, right? And if there's not, that her other needs can be made more easily met, right? Because is some behavioral developmental stuff, which can also be because of poverty. It can also be because of malnutrition. There are other reasons for some of the very clear, like, neglect behavior that she has, because she may be experiencing neglect. She may not be being physically abused. She may be experiencing neglect. So, and a lot of these kids within the indigenous community aren't registered or documented, like they don't exist. And so that means that getting them into school and getting them education is very difficult. I really want, and this little girl, like, seems so intelligent, and there's other children in the community also, but a lot of their parents are either getting them into school or will get them to school next year, or they're very little, or there's other factors. But this little girl in particular just does not seem like she's going to have those opportunities. So if she's not registered, I had talked with the teacher of a local school about the possibility, I actually talked today about the possibility of, like, letting her sit in on classes even though she doesn't exist, so that she can learn things maybe next year, or figuring out how to sponsor her for that, and obviously one would need to talk to her parents. And another issue is, like, for going to school, you have to bathe and have, like, all your clothes and everything, because they don't want to pass diseases on to other kids. So she's a child, somebody else would have to be in charge of that. So how would that happen? Like, are her parents going to do that, or, like, is she old enough to do that herself? And she's comparatively, like, pretty clean. So there's a lot of factors, like, and barriers for a little girl to learn the alphabet even. So another project that we're doing is tomorrow, and the Fridays in the morning I'm going to be setting up a class under the trees for let's learn our alphabet, let's learn to read. The kids do use, in the school, they need pencils and a notebook. Food, it really is hit or miss. The local church makes sure that if people just have to walk up to the church and they'll be given basic foodstuffs like noodles, rice, flour, things like that. And then within the community, a lot of folks raise chickens or something like that. So where's really lacking, unfortunately, children developmentally very much need vitamins and vegetables, and that is quite lacking because of cost. However, some communities, like another community that I've been going to on Wednesdays in the morning, which I pronounce wrong always, that community, a lot of the folks, they grow their own vegetables. So this community is the poorest, this one near my place, which is another reason I decided to focus my efforts there Wednesdays and Fridays rather than on the wealthier government-sponsored community where you're not allowed to talk about anything. One, because I'm only here for 3 months. So, you know, if I'm not allowed to talk about anything, I'm not allowed to talk about sexual abuse, I'm not allowed to talk about or like just be myself, and you have to be so careful everything you say, it's highly probable I might say something wrong. I'm a very naturally outspoken and honest person. If I say something wrong, then it messes up what everyone else is trying to do. So better learn more about the culture and the community before I put myself in a position where I could mess something up, or before, you know, wasting my time. I've already tried to go there twice and was able to like not meet anyone or do anything. And so as far as being useful, since everything in my life causes me pain or costs me pain, I would rather pay pain for a high dividend of usefulness than pay a lot of pain for very little usefulness. So rather than spending my pain there, I want to spend my pain close by, where even though I don't speak Guarani very well, which is another issue, you have to be very well spoken in this more wealthy community. Even though I don't speak Guarani very well, I can speak the language of love here in this community, because I can, you know, go to the store and get blankets, or I can go get milk, or like I can do physical things in conjunction with and supporting local community efforts. Because what you don't want is like the American hero complex paternalistic person coming in, you know, like spreading money around and then leaving 3 months later. And so there's no real long-term impact. So instead, trying to work through the local community, right? I'm not Presbyterian, but I'm working with the local Presbyterian church, working with the local leadership, right? Once I found out who was the leader of this small community here, immediately, like with him and his wife, started working through them, right? To support their authority and not usurp what they're doing. So that's kind of been another important piece. And because they're more like, for lack of a better term, freedom-loving leadership, it's easier to work within there. And they also they actually go to the local Guarani church. So that's like within their context, within their language, and therefore I'm able to be a little bit more useful. And because they're close by, I can trial some things here. So like today, what I was working on for most of the day was I'm trying to come up with translating some of the mental health resources that I use for you guys into a Guarani context, right? So first, they had to go from that into Spanish, and then me and my mbuehara, or my teacher in Guarani, trying to turn it into Guarani. And we have two challenges there. One challenge is literacy. Some people read, and a lot of the exercises that I have for you take advantage of the fact that writing engages the parts of your brain that really help you heal from trauma or help you deal with depression and so forth. So writing is important and beneficial for that, for a lot of these exercises. But what if somebody doesn't know how to write? Then what do? Like, how do you have someone express their story privately if they can't write? So trying to adapt it and adapt the learning materials, I'm going to have to essentially record things in Guarani. Some of them have phones, some of them don't. So how do you play recorded material for them then? So there's a lot of little hurdles to addressing leaving materials that can be self-led or that can be led in a small indigenous-centered, indigenous-led group. So ideally you would ally with someone, for example, who has a phone, right? Or who has the means to play audiovisual equipment. The challenge with giving just audiovisual equipment is when people are hungry, it's going to be sold. So then you can't use it for its intended purpose, and then you lose the mental health aspect. Mental health is often a last resort, even though improving mental health is one of the first ways to improve access to education, economic access, the ability to work, the ability to dream and have a purpose and start to actually change the society and lift it from poverty. Mental health is one of those places it begins, but it's the first place that we disregard as humans. I think we all know that. So there's a lot that's going to try to figure this out. I'm studying my Guarani and I am bad at it. It's so frustrating to be learning another language again when now the previous times that I've learned languages, I've had the advantage of starting when I was within the optimal language learning phase, brain-wise. I am no longer in that phase, and so I'm having to work differently. Fortunately, there are linguistic scaffolds on which I can build my learning just from understanding how other languages work. So that's been what's exciting is I'm able to understand already a lot more than I think I would have if I didn't have some of these bases. And I have to say, I'm in like, I'm a like person of faith, and like I feel like God is helping me. But I wish He would help me more. I wish I would just suddenly have the gift of tongues. That's so ungrateful. I was like, bam, you speak Guarani now. I have confidence and hope that for the right moments, the right words and information will be there. But I have to do my part and put in the work. So trying to translate some of these materials is a bear. The idea is by the end of 3 months, I'll have two projects completed. One project being a very basic scaffold of this mental health resources, even if it's just like the first talk and one activity that they can do that's high impact that they can pass on or keep for themselves. That's one. And two, I'm working on trying to improve local Paraguayan health with a look at vegetables. How do we obtain vegetables that are Paraguayan, that plants that grow natively here and grow well here natively? And so it's not stuff like lettuce, which really comes more from North America, and the average person is a little hard to grow in their backyard. It gets too hot. So there are a lot of underused plants that grow here that are quite healthy. Avocados is one, and so I talked briefly with a agricultural student from the University of Asunción to get a better idea of some underused plants that grow here that are wonderfully edible, that grow well, and that's somebody who's poor could grow and have access to. So after that conversation, went and planted an avocado tree in the community. Also have been looking into trying to celebrate Paraguayan herbal remedies and medicines, gathering the information from there and trying to take notes, because a longer term project is I would like to start analyzing some of those herbs in terms of international laboratories and studies to see bigger applications. I mean, aspirin came from the willow tree, right? There are cancer medications that were discovered in the Amazon. So what knowledge do the Guarani people have that we are going to lose access to within 1 or 2 generations? Because the newest generations of Paraguayans are not learning the herbal medicine that their grandmothers and grandfathers know. So a lot of this herbal indigenous knowledge is going to disappear. So how do we preserve it before it disappears? And then how do we use it within the modern pharmaceutical context? So that's another project that we're working on longer term. That's been a little difficult. I've been trying to find anybody who will teach me something. There was one old lady that I was hoping would teach me, but her son was in the hospital lately, and so it's been difficult to get her to go out with me. But I have 2 other leads, and what's really exciting is essentially the female spiritual leader of the community I go to on Wednesdays, where I've been doing an ultrasound, not a medical ultrasound, because the other project is working on my medical licensing here and transferring it from the United States here, but just a general screening ultrasound to show her baby, and then if there's any alarm that I see, to send her to her doctor, right? And that has been a huge in to this family that was recently affected by suicide. And that is the reason I'm focusing on getting these Guarani context mental health resources, because these things like abuse and trauma and suicide are undertreated in this community, in these communities. And so how do we, within their context, bring them modern resources and comfort? And this family in particular, I've been trying to get a foot in the door. Incidentally, this family is also the girl I've been doing the ultrasounds on, or the woman, is herself like kind of a secret Christian in her people group. Her parents are the leaders of the group, the community. Her mother is essentially the spiritual leader and knows a lot of herbal medicine, and her father is essentially the political leader. So it's a little bit like an Avatar, which is not the norm. They're Ava, so that might be the norm for them, but for the Mbu'a, the shamans are all male. So she's kind of like a shaman, this woman, but herbal medicine is usually passed in Paraguay through women. And so she's got that basis too. And so I'm very excited to be able to learn from her. I've been able to connect with this family really quickly, partly because of my own past trauma. I've been pretty open about like my brother dying, and I've been pretty open too about like my experience with suicide. So they've been in a very short time very friendly to me, which was not what I was led to expect. So hopefully it continues to go like that. I don't want to get my hopes up too high about these things because it's very little by little. But if by the end of the 3 months I can bring some comfort to this family that's been affected by suicide, you know, the 15-year-old daughter, so the youngest sister of the 3 sisters, and you know, they found her body and everything, so it's quite dramatic. And it's partly because this young woman who is Ava was with a young man who is Umbu'a, which is not allowed, apparently. So a lot of dramas and romances and like political things that are within these cultural contexts that kind of affect how you do aid work and how you, share things like intercultural exchange, right? And I really want to hear about, like, I'm really excited to be maybe learning from this religious leader, because I don't just want to like share my things. I want to hear her things. I want to hear what is her religious context and what beliefs do we maybe also have in common. Because sometimes people come in and are just like, we're so different and yours is yours and mine is mine, and we won't, or they'll try to impose theirs on each other. And I'd actually like to have an exchange. I actually want to learn and hear and understand. She was showing me some of the seeds that she wears around her neck that one of the other aid workers there, one of the teachers at the school, was saying that she'd started wearing more since her daughter died, and that it has religious context. But she wasn't talking to me about religious context, and so I'd like to hear from her mouth what she believes it's for. Because that's another thing I've noticed about the indigenous work here. There's a lot of people who say, oh, this is what they believe, or this is what they're like, this is what they think. And I'd rather hear from them what they think. Because I feel like there's some, I'm not doubting the people who've worked here and know, and lived here, but there's also definitely some stereotyping and discrimination from other Paraguayans to indigenous people, or at least stereotyping. I won't say discrimination, because I even flat out asked the local leaders, like, do you feel discriminated against sometimes in your local community? And he was like, nah. I'm like, okay, well, that's good. So, it's complicated, but on the other hand, a lot of them are kicked out of, ancestral lands where they've always lived. So it gets complicated. So the other project I want to do food-wise is this little booklet on Poder Paraguayo, Paraguayan power foods, because I also want to grab and use the nationalistic spirit to advance health, right? In other words, like, you can support Paraguayan economy, you can support Paraguayan environment, and you can support Paraguayan culture by eating healthy yourself with these foods that grow here. The environment is another big issue. Oppressed people oppress the land, or hurting people hurt the land. So in a lot of these communities, there is trash everywhere. And the solution for the trash is to burn the trash, which is just great for all the little lungs. Some places you can bury it, but it's a there's so much trash and little kids running around barefoot, and there yesterday in the community at Uapovontu, I was picking up broken glass from an area where little kids are running around barefoot. And these are like big shards of glass. So that's not great, right? It's like accidents just waiting to happen. But yeah, so that's another thing, is approaching that in a way that's not offensive. So later, towards the end of my time here, I want to go with the local community and talk to the leadership. And the local pastor kind of coached me, the Paraguayan pastor kind of their Guarani church. He coached me on like what would be an appropriate way to approach the trash issue, so that it's very like humble and, you know, what do you have in mind about the trash thing? Because coming from a health professional, I do worry about the kids running around barefoot. But it needs to be like, what do they think? Not like, how can I come in and clean this all up? Because then it'll just be dirty again, right? So making it something that comes from the leadership and is very humble and respecting of them, not like, you guys need to stop fucking throwing trash everywhere. Obviously, I would never come at it like that. But it's an issue, right? Because they're drinking from groundwater, right? That comes from this area. So their, food is growing in this area. So how do we not destroy the natural health and beauty of Paraguay while we are trying to survive as human beings? And, poverty makes that difficult because you are focused on surviving yourself, especially if you are living, essentially outside under the trees. Which is another issue, is that winter is the rainy season, fall is the rainy season especially. So on the one hand, like a couple weeks ago it was quite cold, but now there was a whole bunch of rain and there are a ton of mosquitoes that carry chikungunya and dengue. So one of the projects, hopefully for this week or next week, is to bring mosquito netting to the houses so that we don't just, I already brought spray and I plan to continue doing that, but sometimes people don't want to put on spray, and that's been difficult trying to express with the culture, like, you need to put on spray because, for example, this young Christian woman, she recently had chikungunya, but she does not believe that the mosquitoes are a big factor with the chikungunya. She believes more that this lady hating her has to do with the chikungunya. And that's because of her Mbu'a beliefs. The Paraguayan Christians don't, quote unquote, Paraguayan. Mbu'a people are Paraguayan, but the mixed race Paraguayans essentially don't believe in that. Like, the teacher of the school tried to like argue with her and say like, no, that's not true. The lady's not putting a curse on you. It's because of mosquitoes. But arguing with her does not work because this is her deeply held belief from generations and generations. And I'm not saying that I know better than the local teacher of the school, but I also have less of a place to come in and argue. So instead, my idea is within her context and her beliefs. Well, if you believe it's a spiritual force, let's use your spiritual force. In return, let's pray. Because that's a thing that you can do within your cultural context to deal with that. And in the meantime, beyond prayer, please put on the mosquito spray. Because if by chance I'm right and chikungunya comes from mosquitoes, it would be good to not get chikungunya again. But the mosquito netting may be able to help, because at least I can say like, hey, mosquitoes are really itchy and unpleasant. So maybe you don't like the spray, but this mosquito netting will help keep the mosquitoes away, and it's cool, so it's not going to get too hot. So that's kind of the strategy. So that's going to be my strategy this next week as we approach mosquito eradication. So we've got a lot of, not eradication, but we've got a lot of projects going on where we're trying to figure out how to deal with prevention of abuse, keeping an eye on Elle and what's going on with her just because of some of the red flags, keeping an eye on food and how to support local Paraguayan food. If I make this little pamphlet, we can give it out at health fairs, and if I make sure that it's also in Guarani, it can be something that's also used within these communities. But that is more for Paraguay at large, to try to promote Paraguayan agriculture and Paraguayan grown things so people can improve their access to vegetables. Because if you don't know that a vegetable has a big health property, you may not use it. And they have the benefit that they already know about using herbs. Like, it's a widely used thing to use herbs that you eat for health, whether or not you take it as medication, you take it as like you put it in your tea and it's supposed to help you. So if we come at vegetables the same way, like talking about how, like, okay, passion fruit can help lower blood pressure and improve hypertension, or like garlic can help improve circulation. If we come at it like these are the things that vegetables can do for you rather than eat your vegetables, we're already operating within their cultural context and their tendency to associate medicinal properties with plants. So we just take that a step further and associate, like tomatoes prevent prostate cancer, right? These are things that are studied and proven, and so I can take things that are studied and proven and put them within their cultural context. And that is exciting. So that'll be for the end of July. I want to have that finished. And by the end of July, I'd like to have a beginning draft of this essentially support group framework, and I want to have tested it in this local community for next year testing in other communities. The, top level big boss will be next year to eventually get into Tatamandu and put this mental health framework in that framework, if I can get it in there. And since I've been testing out my kind of martial arts to prevent sexual abuse class, if I do it enough well here and it gets a good response, I can maybe test it in other contexts as well, and people might like that. So that's what we've been working on. Health has been a barrier and has slowed things down, but it's kind of exciting what we've gotten done so far just in almost the first month. So, any questions?